Consider for a moment that your body is not merely a biological organism, it is a physical system. A collection of materials with measurable densities, elastic moduli, fluid pressures, and resonant frequencies. And like every physical system in the universe, it obeys the same laws of mechanics that govern the vibration of a guitar string, the architecture of a suspension bridge, and the acoustic geometry of a concert hall. When you open your mouth and produce a sustained, low-frequency tone, you are not performing a wellness ritual. You are engineering a standing wave inside a rigid biological cavity. You are doing physics. And the consequences of that act reach far deeper into the structure of your nervous system than most people have ever considered. To understand what actually happens, we need to start not with biology, but with wave mechanics. Sound is a pressure wave. It is a periodic mechanical disturbance that propagates through a medium by alternately compressing and expanding the molecules of that medium. When you strike a tuning fork, you set its tines vibrating at a precise frequency. Those vibrations push against the surrounding air molecules, creating regions of high pressure called compressions and regions of low pressure called rarefactions. That pattern of alternating pressure moves outward through the air at roughly 343 meters per second. It carries energy, it carries momentum. And when it encounters a boundary, a wall, a surface, another medium entirely, something remarkable happens. It reflects. Now here is where the physics becomes genuinely extraordinary. When a wave traveling in one direction encounters a reflective boundary and bounces back, it can collide with the incoming wave that is still arriving from the source. Under the right conditions, when the frequency of the wave and the geometry of the cavity are properly matched, these two waves, the outgoing wave and its own reflection, superpose on each other in a very specific way. They produce what physicists call a standing wave. And a standing wave is one of the most beautiful and counterintuitive phenomena in all of classical mechanics. Picture a guitar string stretched between two fixed points. When you pluck that string, waves travel along it in both directions and reflect off the fixed ends. At certain precise frequencies, the reflections align perfectly with the incoming waves, and instead of the string appearing to move in a rushing, traveling pattern, it seems to vibrate in place. Certain points along the string, called nodes, remain completely stationary. Other points, called antinodes, move with violent maximum amplitude. The entire pattern stands still in space while energy pulses rhythmically through it. A standing wave is, in a very real sense, the geometry of energy made visible. Now take that concept and apply it to a closed cavity. Any rigid enclosed space, whether it is a cathedral, an organ pipe, or a drum shell, has what engineers call resonant frequencies. These are specific frequencies at which sound waves traveling back and forth inside that cavity produce stable standing wave patterns rather than chaotic interference. The cavity selects those frequencies. It amplifies them. It literally organizes the sound energy into a coherent geometric structure. This is not a metaphor. This is the physics of acoustic resonance, and it governs every enclosed volume of matter in the universe. Your skull is a closed cavity. This is the central fact that most discussions of humming and the brain completely overlook, because most discussions are not being conducted by physicists. The adult human skull is composed primarily of cortical bone, a composite material with a compressive strength of roughly 170 megapascals, and an acoustic impedance significantly higher than that of the soft tissue it encloses. Acoustic impedance is the resistance a material offers to the propagation of a sound wave, and it is calculated as the product of the material's density and the speed of sound through it. When a sound wave moving through one medium encounters a material with a very different acoustic impedance, a large fraction of its energy is reflected back rather than transmitted through. The boundary between soft brain tissue and the hard bone of the skull is precisely such an impedance mismatch. When you hum and generate acoustic energy inside that cavity, a substantial portion of that energy bounces off the inner walls of your skull and is reflected back into the interior. Your skull acts as an acoustic mirror, and inside that acoustic mirror sits the cerebrospinal fluid. This is a clear, nearly incompressible fluid that circulates continuously around the brain and through the spinal canal. It provides buoyancy, It regulates intracranial pressure, and it acts as a mechanical buffer for the delicate neural tissue it surrounds. But from a fluid dynamics perspective, it is also a medium through which pressure waves can propagate. And when a standing wave establishes itself inside the cranial cavity, the cerebrospinal fluid is not a passive bystander, it is a participant. The alternating pressure gradients of the standing wave act on the fluid, driving it into oscillating flow patterns that mirror the geometry of the wave itself. Here is the analogy that captures this most precisely. In the 1800s, the German physicist Ernst Chladni performed a series of experiments that became famous throughout the scientific world. He took thin metal plates, scattered fine sand across their surfaces, and then vibrated the plates at different frequencies using a violin bow drawn across their edges. At each resonant frequency, something extraordinary happened. The sand, initially distributed at random, began to migrate. The grains moved away from the vibrating regions, the antinodes, and accumulated along the stationary lines, the nodes. The sand self-organized into exquisitely precise geometric patterns. Beautiful, symmetric, reproducible figures that changed their shape as the frequency changed. These are now called Chladni figures, and they are a direct visual record of the standing wave geometry impressed upon a physical medium. The cerebrospinal fluid inside a humming skull undergoes an analogous process. It is not sand on a plate. It is an incompressible fluid enclosed in a three-dimensional cavity, but the physics is directly comparable. The standing wave that forms inside the cranial cavity during sustained humming imposes a specific pressure geometry on that fluid. The fluid is pushed and pulled by alternating pressure differentials. Its flow pattern reorganizes around the nodal and antinodal structure of the wave. This is not a gentle or trivial effect. The mechanical forcing of an enclosed fluid by a pressure wave is the same physical principle behind ultrasonic mixing, acoustic levitation, and the industrial cleaning of precision components. Your skull becomes, for those 60 seconds, a miniature acoustic processing chamber. Now let us move deeper into the neural architecture, because the mechanical effects of that standing wave do not stop at the fluid. The brain itself, despite its extraordinary complexity, is from a mechanical standpoint a viscoelastic solid. It has both elastic properties, meaning it can deform and spring back, and viscous properties, meaning it also dissipates energy through internal friction. When a pressure wave propagates through a viscoelastic material, it does not simply pass through uniformly. It generates what engineers call shear stress. Shear stress is the mechanical force that acts parallel to a surface rather than perpendicular to it. Imagine pushing on two adjacent layers of material, not by compressing them together, but by trying to slide them past each other. That sliding force is shear. The acoustic pressure waves generated during humming propagate through the fluid and tissue of the brain and produce shear stress at the interfaces between regions of differing mechanical properties. At the boundaries between white matter and gray matter, between neural tissue and blood vessel walls, between axon bundles and the surrounding glial matrix. And here is where something that might seem like pure abstract mechanics makes contact with profoundly concrete biology. The cells lining your blood vessels, called endothelial cells, are mechanosensitive. They have molecular receptors that are specifically tuned to respond to mechanical shear stress. When those receptors detect shear, they trigger a biochemical cascade. One of the primary products of that cascade is nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gaseous signaling molecule with a molecular structure of extraordinary simplicity, just one nitrogen atom bonded to one oxygen atom. But its functional range within the cardiovascular and nervous systems is sweeping. Among its most important roles, nitric oxide causes vascular smooth muscle to relax, which dilates the blood vessel, increases blood flow, and reduces vascular resistance. This is not a spiritual effect. This is not a placebo. This is a direct mechanical chain. Acoustic pressure wave, shear stress on endothelial tissue, nitric oxide synthesis, vasodilation. The physics of sound wave propagation has reached directly into the molecular signaling machinery of your vascular system. But the mechanical reach of the standing wave goes further still into the architecture of your autonomic nervous system. Running bilaterally through the neck and chest and abdomen is the vagus nerve, the longest and most anatomically complex cranial nerve in the human body. It is the principal conduit of the parasympathetic nervous system, carrying motor signals to the heart, the lungs, and the digestive organs, and carrying sensory signals back up to the brainstem from those same organs. The vagus nerve passes through a region called the jugular foramen at the base of the skull, runs down through the neck in close proximity to the carotid artery and jugular vein, and branches extensively throughout the thoracic and abdominal cavities. When you sustain a low-frequency hum at a fundamental tone, you are generating acoustic energy in the frequency range of roughly 80 to several hundred hertz. That energy propagates not only through the air in your vocal tract, but through the tissues of your throat and neck via bone conduction and tissue conduction. The vagus nerve, embedded in that soft tissue and enclosed by the rigid cylindrical structures of the cervical vertebrae, is exposed to that mechanical vibration. Think of it as a thick, taut cable stretched along a vibrating chassis. The low-frequency pressure oscillations passing through the surrounding tissue physically displace the nerve at each cycle of the wave. This is a form of mechanical stimulation. And the vagus nerve, being a mechanically sensitive biological cable, responds to that stimulation by altering its firing pattern. The consequence is a shift in the balance of the autonomic nervous system, a reduction in sympathetic tone, and an increase in parasympathetic activity. This is not semantics. These are two distinct branches of the nervous system with directly opposing physiological effects. The sympathetic system increases heart rate, dilates airways, suppresses digestion, and mobilizes energy. The parasympathetic system, via the vagus nerve, slows heart rate, promotes digestion, and orchestrates the body's restorative functions. The ratio of sympathetic to parasympathetic activity can be measured directly through a metric called heart rate variability, the variation in the time interval between successive heartbeats. Higher heart rate variability is a robust physiological marker of parasympathetic dominance and is associated with greater adaptability and resilience in cardiovascular and neural regulation. Acoustic mechanical stimulation of the vagus nerve through sustained low-frequency humming measurably increases heart rate variability. This is testable, reproducible physics, producing testable, reproducible physiology. The sound wave is doing mechanical work on the nerve. The nerve is a physical object. It responds to mechanical input. The outcome is a quantifiable change in the operating state of the autonomic nervous system. Now consider what is simultaneously happening at the level of neural synchronization. The brain does not think in silence. At every moment, billions of neurons are firing electrical impulses, and those firing patterns are not random. They organize into collective rhythms, oscillations that span large populations of neurons and coordinate the timing of information processing across different brain regions. These oscillations occur at specific frequency bands. Delta waves below 4 Hz characterize deep sleep. Theta waves between 4 and 8 Hz are prominent during certain memory encoding processes. Alpha waves between 8 and 13 Hz are associated with states of relaxed, unfocused wakefulness. And the brain, like all physical oscillating systems, is susceptible to a phenomenon called entrainment. Entrainment is what happens when one oscillating system is coupled to another and their rhythms synchronize. A pendulum clock placed on a wall will gradually synchronize its swing with a nearby pendulum clock of slightly different period. The heart cells of 2 neighboring cardiac pacemaker neurons will synchronize their electrical firing if they are placed in physical or chemical contact. This is a universal property of coupled oscillators, derived from the same mathematics that describes resonance, standing waves, and the normal modes of vibration in elastic media. The rhythmic mechanical pressure oscillations of a sustained hum arrive at the neurons of the brain with a precise frequency. Those pressure oscillations couple weakly but measurably to the electrical dynamics of the neural population. The acoustic mechanical input acts as an external rhythmic drive, and the brain, operating as a vast collection of coupled oscillators, has a natural tendency to synchronize with a consistent external rhythm. This is why the frequency you choose when humming matters from a purely physical standpoint. Lower frequencies, in the range associated with alpha and theta oscillations, provide an external mechanical drive that is closer in period to the brain's own natural low-frequency modes, potentially strengthening the coupling between the acoustic input and the neural oscillation pattern. There is a further physical mechanism operating on the paranasal sinuses, which deserves specific attention. These are air-filled cavities in the skull, the maxillary sinuses in the cheekbones, the frontal sinuses in the forehead, the ethmoid sinuses between the eyes, and the sphenoid sinus deep in the skull behind the nose. Each of these cavities has its own resonant frequency, determined by its volume, its shape, and the size of its opening. During nasal breathing with the mouth closed, the sinuses communicate with the nasal cavity through small openings called ostia. During humming, with the mouth closed and the vocal folds engaged, a significant fraction of the acoustic energy produced travels upward through the nasal cavity and into resonant coupling with these sinus chambers. The paranasal sinuses are lined with ciliated epithelium, and they are the site of nitric oxide production in the upper airway. The concentration of nitric oxide in the paranasal sinuses is substantially higher than in the lower airways. During normal nasal breathing, nitric oxide diffuses slowly into the inhaled airstream and reaches the lungs, where it contributes to pulmonary vasodilation and regulation of airway smooth muscle tone. During humming, the acoustic pressure oscillations inside the sinus cavities increase dramatically, and the gas exchange rate between the sinuses and the nasal cavity increases by a factor of approximately 15 compared to quiet nasal breathing. This is not a subtle change. The standing wave established in the sinus cavity during humming effectively pumps nitric oxide out of the sinus and into the airway at a substantially enhanced rate. The physical mechanism is acoustic streaming, the net directional flow of a gas induced by the acoustic pressure gradient of a standing wave. So the act of humming for 60 seconds is, from the perspective of physics, a layered sequence of mechanical interventions. A standing wave forms inside the cranial cavity and mechanically reorganizes the flow patterns of the cerebrospinal fluid. Shear stress from acoustic pressure waves acting on vascular endothelial cells drives the synthesis of nitric oxide and produces vasodilation. Low-frequency vibration mechanically stimulates the vagus nerve and shifts the autonomic nervous system toward parasympathetic dominance, increasing heart rate variability. The rhythmic acoustic drive provides an external oscillatory input that couples to the brain's own neural oscillation patterns through the physics of entrainment. And acoustic streaming from standing waves inside the paranasal sinuses delivers an enhanced pulse of nitric oxide into the lower airway, affecting pulmonary blood flow regulation. Each of these effects is a direct consequence of the physical properties of sound waves interacting with the mechanical and fluid properties of biological materials. There is no mystery here that requires anything other than the equations of wave mechanics, fluid dynamics, and materials science. The human body is a physical system embedded in a physical universe, and sound, as a mechanical phenomenon, interacts with it on purely mechanical terms. What this reveals is something profound about the relationship between matter and information, between the physical structure of the world and the way that structure can be deliberately shaped by introducing energy in organized, coherent patterns. When you impose a standing wave on a fluid, you are not adding chaos. You are adding geometric order. You are selecting, from the infinite space of possible fluid configurations, a specific organized state that mirrors the mathematical structure of the wave. This is what the universe does at every scale, from the formation of atomic orbitals to the crystallization of snowflakes to the emergence of galaxy filaments. Resonance is the universe's preferred mechanism for transforming random distributions of energy into structured, coherent, organized form. And for 60 seconds, when you sustain a tone and let the physics run its course inside the resonant chamber of your skull, you are participating in exactly that process. You are not calming yourself down. You are reorganizing matter. You are doing what the universe has always done. You are letting wave mechanics impose order on the geometry of a physical system. The physics was always there, waiting for you to become the source.